Welcome to the Beauty Amidst the Ashes podcast, featuring conversations and stories designed to equip, mobilize, and encourage the church and families to engage in adoption and caring for children who need families. I'm your host, Carl Christensen. Want to welcome you today. If you're joining with us and watching this on video, you're on YouTube, or if you're listening, you're probably on Apple Music or Spotify. We just want to thank you for being here and joining with us today. I want to introduce Katie, who's serving as one of our board members, and she's going to be doing the interview today. Super thankful to have you on board, Katie, and to be here.
Yeah, I am so excited to be here, and especially to get to talk about one of my best friends, Peggy. Yeah, thank you so much for asking me to come.
BFFs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and I am Peggy Porter. I am development coordinator here with Beauty Amidst the Ashes, and I'm the one being interviewed today. That's the change. I'm not the interviewer. I'm the interviewee, I guess. Is that what you say?
Yeah, interviewee.
Yeah, for sure. For foster care and adoption. So
Yeah,
excited about today's podcast.
Yeah, so I'm excited just to talk about your story, and I love you as a person. I feel
Thank
like
you.
you're just amazing.
You're pretty much a big deal, Peggy.
No. Okay, continue.
So humble.
And I'm just thankful to have like people, even when you're talking about, you know, your story and what God has done in your life, to have people who love you and support you and can ask you the vulnerable questions that need to be asked. It's important, you know, and so that's what this podcast is going to be doing, is, you know, being able to get to that vulnerable part of stories and to, you know, just talk about it and be real. So I'm excited. So I'm so glad that you're here, Katie.
Thank you. Okay, so I would love just to start off just by telling like your story about how we met even.
Yeah.
Because that's even
Special.
tells your story about adoption.
For sure.
So we actually had a mutual friend,
Anna Marie.
Shout out. We love you.
We love you.
Who connected us and was like, hey, you both are extremely passionate about adoption, and
You're tall, you're blonde. You got a lot in common.
yeah. So we followed each other on Instagram.
Yeah.
Message each other and we're like, hey, we should get coffee because we both want to change the world, and let's do that.
Yeah. World changers, same mindset, kingdom work. We had to connect for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And it was really special. And right away we connected on
Absolutely.
the love for adoption and foster care and the passion behind it. And it came into now, almost 2 years, a little bit under 2 years now,
Crazy.
but having a really close friendship, and now you being on board with the organization that I'm so passionate about.
So
It's pretty cool. God is really good. So
Yeah. So
sure.
just to start off, tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah.
Where does it begin?
Obviously, I mean, it begins at birth, you know, the beginning, you know, where my parents, I was born baby Peggy. I was born to a couple here in Iowa who were not married and had a lot of struggles within their life. Obviously, there was a lot of past trauma for them too, you know, and I always, you know, want to bring to light as I'm telling my story. They obviously had a lot that happened to them as adults and as children, and but they were within the system. They were within the foster care system, and also just having different difficulties within their family life. So not really having a supportive family life as they grew up led to toxic mindset when it came to relationships. So I was born, and within the first 5 years of my life, it was obvious that there was going to be trauma within that. And so very quickly, the state intervened, and I was kind of in and out of the system at a young age. You know, there was questions of care and if they were able to care for a child and things. And it really wasn't until my little brother was born that it was like obvious that like, hey, they're not able to, they need some help. You know, the state had to intervene. And that was kind of a pivotal moment for the state to get intervened, was actually where my little brother was born, and my birth mom, it was my birth dad was gone, and my birth mom was passed out from drugs and partying the previous night.
Wow.
And I got up, and my brother was crying, and obviously she was not able to respond to that need. And so my survival instinct, you know, if you know anything about trauma, survival kicked in, and I packed my baby brother, who, I mean, was very, very newborn, months old, into a doll stroller, and proceeded to take him across a 4-lane highway because I was so hungry. Like, I hadn't eaten anything in a long time.
And you were 5?
I was 5.
Oh my goodness.
And it was at that moment, people can't believe that, but when you face that trauma, you're forced to mature very quickly.
Grow up
and
young.
you know, when you study psychology, it's very clear that when trauma happens, you do have to mature quickly.
Yeah.
And that looks like different for each life. And so for me, that was survival.
Okay.
And so I did. I survived, and I took my little brother across the 4-lane highway, and the lady that, you know, saw us, you know, asked us questions and kind of, was like, this is not normal. This is dangerous. And it was that moment the cops, stepped in.
Yeah. So can you take me through that day of what it was when, the state intervened?
Yeah.
So, that's something, with trauma, there are situations and things that I faced in my life that I can't remember and that my mom would later tell me, my adoptive mom would tell me later. But that is one day that I won't forget. And it's not necessarily with any bitterness, but it's just understanding that was something that was traumatic for me. That was kind of something I will forever remember, even at such a young age.
Yeah.
So I, once the police came, I didn't have a really good relationship with police. Police was associated with mom and dad are in trouble. Birth parents are in trouble. So I didn't want anything to do with the police. I was really confused. Why were they here? I was just, I was fine. There was nothing wrong. So the police took us back to the apartment, did the research, and without any hesitation, right away, they had already gone to Heidi and were at the house, and she was, yelling and screaming, and, upset and wanting her babies. And so for me, that was the situation where it was like, I couldn't comprehend necessarily what was going on, but I knew it wasn't good. And I just remember being handed like a trash bag of things, just random things that they grabbed from my house, and being told that everything was going to be okay and that I was safe now.
How did you think and feel during that time?
I felt every single feeling. You feel every single feeling of just like confusion and what's going on, and like, ooh, I get to ride in a cop car. Like as a 5-year-old, I was like taking my surroundings. But then on top of that, I did not feel safe. There was like, safe was not the feeling that I felt when I was told I was safe, And so, and that was partly because at that time too, I realized that I was being separated from my baby brother. And that was something that was kind of my survival at that moment, was I'm taking care of my baby brother. That's my job. And when that job was taken from me, it was kind of a broken moment for me. Is that like, what's happening?
Yeah.
Because previously that trauma was normal for me. I didn't really know what normal, like I would say that they loved me, but they didn't know how to show it. And so the trauma that I faced, whether that was neglect, sexual, emotional abuse and physical abuse, the things that I had experienced during that time, it was normal for me. I knew it wasn't right, but I knew it was normal. And for me that was like, something's wrong, but like, I couldn't comprehend it, but it was like that overwhelming that I was not safe. You're told, hey, I'm safe, that I wasn't safe. That was not what I felt. So it was then, and then I was placed into a foster home right away, with the bag of things that, a pillow, some clothes, random clothes that some cops picked up and intervened. And then I was placed in a home and was basically like, hey, like, mommy and daddy will see you soon. And no timeline, nothing, no really information, just this is where you're going to stay, and you're going to be okay.
I cannot imagine that. That's crazy.
Yeah. It was pretty, it's like one of those things that like you can't forget. You really can't forget that moment. And it's not, now it's like definitely like a time where I can just, tell you that like how important it is when those children, when kids in the foster care system are placed in your home, that you need to right away establish that relationship of safety, because they can be told they're safe, but if they don't feel it, you're not going to get anywhere with them. They're not going to respond to you. They're not going to give you, they're not going to open up about their feelings. If you do not show them that they are safe through your personality, through how you talk to them, eye contact, how you approach them, if you don't show that to them, they won't feel it. And I didn't feel it in my first foster home. Wow. And that started a very spiral down cycle for me as a 5-year-old, is not feeling safe.
Okay. So what was your first foster home like?
Obviously there was a lot of factors that played into it. I don't ever want to like say that like the first foster home was like terrible, but I would say that it was not a good fit for me. I didn't get along with the parents. I was not being counseled properly. I was being put on drugs after drug after drug after drug by the system. And so they were trying to cover up symptoms without giving me the resources to heal, which obviously when you're still going through trauma, it is hard to do that. But I wasn't giving the resources. I was being drugged. I was being given medication for children ages 18 and older. I was on so many medications, so many. And it was pretty traumatic for me. So basically I was numb. And when that happens and when you're numb physically, you can still feel emotions, but your body doesn't feel anything. And so that led to a cycle of acting out in harm, in not understanding boundaries when it came to hurting and like danger, not understanding any danger issues. But, one of the situations that did come from that first foster home was where obviously, foster parents, you're taught the right way to handle a child who has faced trauma, and they were not instilling that into the household. They were not taking what they had learned in class into their home. Okay. And because of that, it was causing more and more trauma in my life. And so that first foster home I ended up, obviously I share this vulnerably, but I ended up, biting and causing physical harm, which landed me into, and then because of the numbness and because of the drugs, trying to commit suicide as a 5-year-old. You have to just like really get raw with that and just realize that at that point I was so broken and so numb. As a 5-year-old, you would think that a child would even think that, have come to that place of, hey, I feel like there's no point of living anymore. And so,
wow.
It's hard to be vulnerable about that because I can't imagine, like, I'm so thankful that God was there and intervened and protected me because I clearly didn't understand what was going on to me. I couldn't process. I couldn't heal. I couldn't understand what I was going through. All I was numb, and that placed me into a mental hospital actually for several years, or for a year, 12 months into a year. And that was actually really good for me because it separated me from that toxic thing. And I started to show progress in my lifestyle and how I was. But that's ultimately, again, that plays into the fact of how Care and Share came about, because I was placed in that mental hospital for trauma and for, numbness and trying to get the right drugs. It wasn't that they were saying that I was like, mentally challenged or disturbed. They were just saying that I could not handle the trauma and I needed to have 24/7 watch. And so because I had to have 24/7 watch, then it was a mental hospital.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just real quick too, for those listening, you mentioned Care and Share.
Yeah.
Why don't you quickly share just what that is so people aren't.
I will. And that was something that over Christmas, I didn't have anyone caring for me over Christmas. I didn't have Christmas presents coming to me. Kids were getting Christmas presents sent in by their parents or their biological parents or foster parents, and I didn't get anything. And that for me, I mean, it's like traumatic to think that a child would go without Christmas presents. And for me, that was when I met for the first time with Diana. It was like, oh wow, like, yeah, I want to do that. That's 100% what God, God placed that on my heart. I want every child to have a Christmas gift. And so I kind of took that under my, direction and my development and made Care and Share and work with Four Oaks Family Connections. And I'm so thankful for Mindy. Mindy is an amazing person to work with. I really, really love that connection and that bond that we have, and just, working with Four Oaks and doing that, and the people who have donated it. I mean, it brings me to tears every year. Every year at the conference, I cry because it's such a powerful and wonderful
boxes full of toys,
full of wonderful toys, nice toys,
multiple boxes.
And to think that a child is receiving something, regardless of whether that's just simply even helping the foster parents if they were placed, last minute or whatever. So it's powerful. It's not just simply giving a gift. It could be simply giving a child hope. Really, because that's how children see love, is through gifts a lot of times. And I didn't receive that love that year. I didn't feel that love that year at Christmas time. And I was very much aware that was missing for me. But and so that kind of set me again, like going through that. I was eventually admitted out of the hospital. I saw progress. They got my medications back on track. Still too much for a 5-year-old, still on a lot of things, that's but crazy. They got it balanced out, and I was able to function again and go back to school. And by that time I was going to start preschool, and then I was placed in a different foster home. But between that time, obviously the records, if you ever go through adoption, there are so many records to go through. And from what my parents could tell, I was in a different foster home every month after that, pretty much from then. It was back and forth. I would go into respite because I was so much for the family. And then I would go out because I was processing. I was a troubled child within youth. I mean, I was labeled very heavily.
So how many different foster homes did you live in?
They think between like 10 to 18, depending on.
Wow.
Just like when that adds respite in as well, just going in between foster home and respite. And I could not stay. I was always on the move, and that caused a lot of trauma within.
Were you always with your brother?
No. Yeah. That was something that the state actually intervened with. So, after going through a lot of that process and a lot of that transfer to transfer and not really knowing how many, you have an estimated amount of number, but when you have all those records, it's hard to really clearly, but it was obviously way too many for my situation. I needed stability. And so we actually, the state decided to put us together in the same foster home, and they saw a lot of progress within my life. Obviously it wasn't perfect, but they saw a lot of progress. And so we were placed in the same foster home. And that was something that I was a relief for me, because I was able to make sure that he was safe and he was with me and it was going to be okay. That was where really my safety was being with Logan and feeling that like, it's going to be okay. We're going to be together.
That you're not alone.
And in a sense, with him coming back, and being with you, you really got a part of your identity back.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
having your brother there with you and feeling secure and feeling safe and feeling
familiar.
This is familiar, and this is what I know to be family.
Yeah.
And when Logan and I were separated at that moment and not really together, that was hard on me because for me, that was something that was taken away from me that was so important. Everything had been taken away from me. You know, I hadn't done anything and I had everything taken away from me.
Wow.
And to have that one thing given back to me, that was the most important thing. Like, you know, regardless, I did bond with my biological parents, but the most important thing to me was my little brother. And to have that given back to me was something very special to me. Absolutely. And that was really that hope that I needed during that time.
Absolutely.
And during that trauma. So I was very thankful that God, you know, worked that out, that we could be back together. And that was very important. And he still is, you know, number one a lot in my life and how much I love him and want the best for him. But wishing during that time that we didn't spend so much time apart, but understanding that, you know, God had a plan and God protected us both and brought us back together because that was ultimately what was going to happen. And he knew that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I think of like 5-year-olds, I think of little kids who have like all these big dreams and like want to be a doctor, want to be a rock star, who knows what. So what was your dream as a kid in that season?
Well, it actually started with my salvation story.
Oh, really?
So when I was, as I was going through foster care, I was then placed in Mark and Bonnie Porter's home as a foster child. Okay. So within that process, we stayed at this one foster home before Mark and Bonnie, who are now my adopted parents. So that's kind of a key into my adoption, but we're really focusing on foster care here. But they were foster parents at first, and our rights were not terminated yet. And so the court ruled and the psychologist ruled that we should stay together. And so we were moved to Bonnie and Mark's house. And I remember feeling so safe there right away, like walking into the house and just feeling safe.
Wow.
And so because of that, I mean, really at that young age, you don't really think about your dreams. You're so focused on just surviving. You can't really think about the future when you're surviving. You can think about every day doing what you need to do in order to, you know, am I going to have food today? Am I going to have a bed today? Am I have, is mom and dad going to come back today? Or am I not going to, you know, where am I going to be? Am I going to be with new people? You know, I was at that time afraid of father figures and man. Next? Yeah. What happens next? And just like men in the life were very scary to me. And so to think that I would be going to a new home with a new dad figure, it was pretty traumatic for me. But ultimately I think that dream again came from my adoption story. So being placed in Mark and Bonnie Porter's home, I was instilled in a daily church life, and that was so good for me to be in a community, a church community. I got to know, my best friend Haley, and just like, you know, from then on being attached to the hip with her and building that bond of sisterhood with her, and even now being best friends with her now, and just keeping that friendship was so essential to me to have that sister in my life. And it just instilled in me these relationships. And then it was a moment after church, it was around Christmas time. The pastor had just given the gospel and then had a baptism, and I was like, that's cool, I want to be baptized.
How old were you?
I would have been like 6, just turning 6.5.
That's really young.
Yeah, it was. But what I credit that to was understanding the effects of sin.
Yeah.
I did not have to question what sin looked like in my life. I was very well aware of sin's consequences.
Well, you grew up so young.
Yeah. I knew that sin had its consequences, and it was, I didn't deserve to be in the situation that I was, but I still could see the beauty within my life. Like the joy of it, even though there was a lot of sin and there was a lot of brokenness, there was still a lot of beauty. And so I was able to separate that. And that, you know, I really do credit that from what I went through and understanding the sin and the effects of sin on my life and my parents on my life and my own. But then to see that safety within Mark and Bonnie Porter's house, it really gave me a good perspective. And I just remember being like, oh, baptism is so cool. And then they're like, well, this is why we get baptized. And I said, well, I believe that. Like, I do believe that. I've not doubted that. I'm very well aware of that. And they were just like, okay, well, do you know, tell us what you believe. And I said, I believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins and I am a sinner. And it was just a moment I can literally, like, I know, sitting on the couch and praying and just like accepting completely that, you know, Jesus Christ is my savior, and just like being completely like understanding and fully immersed in like the love that Christ had for me and who had protected me and kept me safe during all of that trauma, you know, neglect, physical abuse, you know, emotional abuse, and just like the unsafe feelings that I had, that he had carried me through all of that. And I remember, you know, my mom, you know, obviously the joy of my family at that moment. And then for me to look up and just be like, well, then I've got to help them too. And at that moment, my mom was like, help who? And I was like, well, kids like me.
My heart.
And
Oh,
it
my
was kind of
goodness.
just like, as a 6-year-old, like looking back, me 21 now,
Yeah.
looking back and being like, I didn't like, that was God assuring me of what my future looked like. I didn't know what that looked like.
That's
Who knows what that
amazing.
looks like? But I
Yeah.
had that passion of like,
Yeah.
I don't want other kids to feel what I felt without that hope and without that family.
You
So-
are so selfless in everything, in your story and everything, and even what you're doing now. It's
Thank you.
amazing.
I mean,
Yeah.
and obviously, like anyone who knows me knows that I was a naughty child as a kid. I had a lot.
I don't believe it.
Oh,
Troublemaker.
yeah, so perfect, right? No, I was very naughty as a child, but I understood who Christ was in my life, and I knew that He had a purpose for me, and that my parents never doubted the potential that I had as a child.
Yeah.
The state doubted my potential. And I'll talk about that for a second, because the state labeled me as a heavily labeled child. I would not graduate high school. I would not be able to work in communications. I would basically they didn't expect me to be able to have relationships with people my age due to the trauma that I faced, how I grew up and the trauma that I had faced. My emotional level would not be able to connect with that. They suspected that I would, constantly struggle with depression and suicide and things like that. And I can tell you that once I was placed in Mark and Bonnie Porter's home, the process of healing was messy, but it was consistent, and it was a gradual progression of healing.
Yeah.
And it will always be a progression of healing. I think when anyone faces trauma, I mean, that can look like a health issue, that can look like losing a family member. But for me, that was grieving the loss of what I had known and the trauma that I had faced. And that was understanding that, yes, it happened to me, but that wasn't my worth, and that wasn't my end story. I wasn't done there. That's not where I'm supposed to stay.
Yeah.
And I think when I fully grasped that, it was a healing process of Mark and Bonnie Porter telling me, no, you are not going to stay here. You're not going to stay in this place of hurt. You're going to keep moving. And that's what I did. And ultimately made me who I am. And, a lot of my credit, obviously God, the purpose and his plan was clear, but my adoptive parents were the key role and they played the key role in my life of healing because they instilled in me consistent, unconditional love. Without that, I wouldn't be who I am today.
What an amazing testimony of just everything that the state labeled you with.
Yeah.
And then to see you now, you're not supposed to work in communications.
Yeah.
You're right now here.
I
on
am
a
in
podcast.
communications. Yeah.
Yeah. You're not supposed to have relationships with people other ages. We're right now here.
And we have bonds. I have incredible bonds.
Oh my goodness. And you're doing incredible things.
And the whole time you're sharing, I'm just thinking
Wow.
of the verse. It's Genesis 50:20 that says, what the enemy is intended for evil,
Yep.
God's intended for good.
Yeah.
And here,
Preach.
sharing your story, a lot of evil, a lot of heartbreak, disappointment.
And I, even I shared with Katie, even before the conference, before I spoke as a main speaker, I said, Katie, I don't want this to be about me. And I don't even want this podcast to be about me. I want this to be that if you have the mindset for foster care and adoption and this child is labeled, that is not their potential.
Yeah.
That's not their worth. Just because they're told this is what they will do doesn't mean that is who they are. The state is very quick to label because that is, sometimes they have to in order to warn the family, this is what you could face.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily where they're going to stay. If you're facing something in your life as an adult, think about what you would feel like if somebody said, you're never going to change, you're never going to be able to get better, you're never going to be able to do something.
Yeah.
We should not be doing that to children. We should not be telling them that is their potential. We should help them through that. If that is something they're going to face for the rest of their life, then you should help them get to that point of coping, healing, and the process, and get them incorporated it with people who will help them get through that,
Absolutely.
And your story is such an example of God just giving you a new identity.
Absolutely.
All those things that they thought you were going to identify with, and then you're adopted just like how God adopts us into his family.
Yeah.
And we get a new identity.
Yes.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So back to your foster care story. What was your biggest struggle when you were in the foster care system?
Wow. My mind races, thinking about that. The biggest struggle was not knowing where I was going to be the next day. Not knowing, because regardless of how, I feel now about the situation, all I wanted to be back was with my biological mom and dad. That was all that I wanted. I didn't want anything else.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was not the healthy situation for me. That was not where God had me to be in the future, but that was where I wanted to be. And I think that was a constant struggle for anyone who had me. It was clear that, when a child doesn't want you, they're going to make it absolutely impossible for you to care for them, think about a little kid who doesn't want to, no, don't, I don't want you to help me. Don't help me. And the resistance, that was me 24/7. And I made it very difficult for every foster family that had me because I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be with my birth mom and dad. Eventually that I was able to process that was not what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, when Mark and Bonnie Porter sat me down in the living room and said, hey, would you like to be our daughter? Would you like for us to adopt you? Would you like to be Peggy Porter? No hesitation. Yes, please. I would love that. That is who I am. And at that time, that was who I was, because Mark instilled in me my worth as a woman, as his child, and as, you know, a daughter of Christ. You know, he was the one that instilled in me ultimately that was my worth, and my mom instilling me my skills, my piano skills, my musical skills. They incorporated into me. They saw my potential, and they instilled and they invested in those potentials. It didn't matter the money. I mean, I had not had a nice dress and shoes in that foster care. I had only clothes that were hand-me-downs and clothes that I had previous. I didn't have new clothes. And so I had been in a foster care family. Short story, you know, so if you think that gifts don't matter, I had been in this foster family. I had not received gifts that were mine. I did not have anything that was mine. I went to Mark and Bonnie Porter's house, and they bought me a dress and church shoes. And they said, these are yours. We're going to keep them here, but they're yours. And I went back and told my previous foster family, and they said, you're lying. And I remember just feeling defeated at that moment. Like, no, I'm not. Like, I'm not. This is mine. This is my dress. These are my shoes. And I went back to Bonnie, and I was like, they're my dress and my shoes. And she was like, yes, they are. You know?
Yeah.
And it was just kind of like finding that, like, they instilled that worth in me. They gave to me, even regardless of how bad I was or how disrespectful I was. But they'll be the credit of what I faced. I didn't cuss. I didn't do anything. I didn't want to have anything to do with drugs or alcohol at that time. I wanted to be completely separated from it, because I didn't want anything to do with that lifestyle, because that was not who I wanted to be. Yeah. I was starting to separate sin and good, you know, the toxicity of the situation and the healing and safety of it. And I was starting to see that. So for sure.
That's incredible.
But I would say that, you know, going back to that point of what was the difficulties would be just, regardless of how, you know, if you're doing foster care, you will see the child. If the child is fighting you, don't think that it's you. It might be just the fact that they want to be back with their birth mom and dad. And that's natural. That's nature. That's what they're meant to be. It's, you know, adoption is a result of brokenness. Yeah. You know, we see the beauty amidst it eventually, obviously, but at that moment, that brokenness is, they're supposed to be with their birth mom and dad. And they have to have that time to process that.
And grieve and
Take us back to when Mark and Bonnie said, we want you and your brother to be a part of our family. What was that like for you? I mean, what was going through your mind? Because like you just shared, like ultimately you want reunification, and that's the overall goal of foster care. To be, you know, to be honest.
Well, like I was saying, I was starting to separate the unsafe feeling and the safe feeling.
Yeah.
So when I was with Mark and Bonnie Porter for the little bit that I was, you know, still within the foster care system, I would do visits, right? You know, and you would visit your birth family, and I would come back traumatized by the unsafe of the situation. And that wasn't their fault. It was just that feeling of rejection and not being enough, and that feeling. And that's just what a child feels. You know, I want to say, like, my birth parents had things in their lives that they could not deal with as a person, and they did need help. And at some point in my life, I, you know, might decide to see them, but that's my choice. And my parents have always given that back to me. You know, if you want to have that contact, you can. But ultimately, that moment, it wasn't necessarily that, you know, when they asked if I wanted to be adopted, it was kind of a duh moment, because I had already been like, well, this is where I belong.
Wow.
And that was because of how they made me feel, that unconditional love, that worth, that investment that they made into me was like, well, yeah, because you guys love me, you know, and you show that to me.
Yeah.
And I remember, you know, I always credit that moment back to my middle name choice too, because they didn't want to change my first name because Peggy was such a special name. It sounds like a grandma name. I know. I always say, I'm like, it sounds like it's not, nobody my age has
all
the
the
name
Peggy's
Peggy.
watching.
I'm sorry. No, just like
all
it's
the
not
grandmas out there.
It's not my generational name. And I was like, no, we should change my first name. And they're like, no, we love you for Peggy. We're not going to change your first name, but we would like to change your middle name. And my dad was the one that wanted joy because I brought so much joy into their life. And it was that moment that I was like, this is where I'm going to be forever. I didn't have to doubt that. And so I became Peggy Joy, and that's kind of who, you know, Peggy Joy Porter. And that was my identity. And it was even before the court signed the papers, this was what God wanted me to be. And that was my potential. And that was where I was going to go. It wasn't finished. Like, adoption isn't a final story. I never want to feel like, oh, like I was fine and I was a great kid and I was good. No, there was a lot of healing and there was a lot of trauma that I still had to process, but I had to process it in a safe space with people who love me. And so, yeah, I became, at that moment when they asked me, I was Peggy Joy Porter. There was no doubt. So,
Wow. So what was the moment when you started to trust your family? When did that happen?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I don't really have a moment where I can say I trusted them, but I can say that because they gave me that consistency and that routine, that I didn't have to start. I doubt was left the equation. So trust was there, you know, doubt was no longer like, they're not going to just send me back to the state. They're not going to give me off to somebody else. They're going to pick me up from school. They are going to be home when I get there. Mom's going to be the one that I wake up to in the morning, you know, and having that, it was just that gradual, eventual, you know, hey, like I'm safe. And I think really though, I will say though, that bond started when I was first in the foster care system with my mom, and my mom is like my best friend, but being the one to be like in middle school, she was the one that I went to with all my problems, everything, you know.
Middle school's hard.
It is hard. Yeah, for sure. But just being the one to just like not being able to, and like learning that and just like, but you're also facing things on top of being middle school and all the changes that you go through physically and psychologically, but I was facing things like, well, you don't look like your parents. Why do your parents look like your grandparents? Or like, do you ever want to see your birth parents? Like, don't, you know, when they found out you're adopted, you know, questions like that are triggers, you know, and I spoke about that in my session, and I'm sure we will have another episode.
I think it's like that for almost any adoptee too. I know I dealt with that too, growing up adopted. Yeah. You know, like I don't look like my, you know, adoptive parents and stuff like that. So I think that almost any adopted kid probably would face that at some point in their life.
Yeah. And my mom had to see that because it would reflect my behavior too. Yeah. You know, I would come home from school and be just terrible. And she would be like,
you're not my real mom.
Yeah. Or just like, don't, you can't tell me what to do. You're not my mom, goodness. You know? And it wasn't necessarily that I felt that, but because, or it could just be, I was just bad that day. My attitude, my behavior, I just was trauma. Yeah. Trauma was coming out, and she started to realize that like, hey, something happened on the bus today. A kid was, you know, very rude or said something, or there was, you know, a sound, a smell, and because I was so close,
those triggers.
Right. And because I was so close to where my birth parents had lived, there were people in my life that knew me before I was in the foster system. And I would see that and I would be unsafe. You know, I'd go home, mom, and be like, this person knows mom, you know, like my birth parents' mom, and I just don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. And that eventually led to them homeschooling me to give me that safety because that's what I wanted. I only wanted safety. Yeah. And if I didn't feel that safety, then I, you know, could not focus on the daily life.
And I can imagine how hard that would have been to like explain what your needs were and wants were and what was happening and what you were processing when you were that young.
Yeah. And I couldn't. I couldn't explain that. And my parents couldn't understand that necessarily. But they had to separate at that time what was trauma and what was bad behavior. And they weren't perfect. And they'll be the first to admit that they weren't perfect. I've seen that because that is very hard. But they tried. And that because they tried, it became more and more, they could separate those two, the triggers and the bad behavior, the sin problem and the triggers, because the triggers are not sin problems. And I will say that 100 times over. Triggers are not something that you should punish. Triggers are something that you should heal through. This is what we're going through. This is how we're going to do it. And that could look like boundaries, but it should not look like punishment. Okay. And that's just something I'm very passionate about, is that, you know, that could mean sitting down and redirecting the situation, diffusing the situation, however that looks like for that child. What works best is important, because punishment won't work when they saw Dragon Tales and that reminds them of their birth dad and that was their favorite show. No amount of punishment is going to correct that behavior. It's only going to make things more confusing. And so you might not know it, but you just have to learn how that child is behaving at that time. And that is an individual child's relationship with the parents. Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
That is great advice. Do you have any other advice for foster parents?
Be patient.
Okay.
Because, you know, each placement that you get, they are readjusting to you, rules, situations, guidelines, boundaries. And because of that, that is, I mean, you just have to have empathy. It's hard.
And unconditional love.
But empathy. Yeah. Understand that they don't feel safe. You can be the safest atmosphere for them. They don't feel safe because they haven't been shown that example. Yeah. Absolutely. They haven't been shown that example of safety. And until they can feel that, then they can really get there. So just be patient. Give them those help. Listen. Yeah. You know. And even just like understanding that it's a process, you know, and as we would want somebody to forgive us we have to forgive them for those things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very quick to be able to get bitter on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's very quick to be like, if I want to be forgiven for all the things that I've done, then I will forgive them too,
Yeah.
you know, regardless. And just really just being sensitive to, you know, how the child behaves and acts towards certain things. And I don't know. I just unconditional love and boundaries and consistency in
And just giving
routine.
that child a voice too. You know, for me, I was adopted at 3 days old, you know,
wow.
and my story is very different than Peggy's, but growing up adopted, I still had things that triggered back to my adoption, you know, that somebody gave me up. I didn't like that, even though it was out of a good heart, you know, and a sacrificial love. I couldn't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still things that I had to process that I would feel like I would bring up to my parents that maybe a normal parent wouldn't understand or get. Like, why is he dealing
Or
with
just
that?
be like, that shouldn't be a
Like,
problem.
I don't
You shouldn't
understand
have
that.
to.
Yeah, that shouldn't be an issue. That
fine.
shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
You're fine.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of
Wow.
pushing that to the side, saying
Yeah.
you just need to get past that. When
Yeah.
really behind that, there is an issue that needs to be dealt with, that needs to
talked
be
about.
heard, that needs to be listened to,
Because
that needs
while
to
it
be
might-
covered in love.
It might seem minor to them. If it's bothering, it's worth talking about. If it's
Yeah.
something that's worth talking about, it needs to obviously
That's right.
because processing comes
Yeah.
through conversation, therapy,
Yeah.
psychology.
Well,
You have to
sometimes-
talk through things.
And listening is love.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just being there for somebody, even when you don't know what to say, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't have to know what to say.
Yeah.
That's
But
That's
it
really
says
good.
a lot to a child, just having that somebody to listen to, having that somebody
Yeah.
to cry with when you need to, having that somebody that just that
Mm.
child just knows that they're there
But you know what my
and
mom
that they care.
my mom
Yeah.
jokingly says, and it's really, we'll still have conversations about it. I could debate my parents. I mean, it could be about something so stupid as a episode that we watched that they had an opinion on something. And I was like, nope, that's not right. And I would debate them for hours on it. I would debate and debate and debate. And they said that is why I am passionate about what I am, is because at a young age, I process very well. I got to that point where I was like, I'm not going to hold it and I am going to process. I am going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And because of that, I was able to be passionate and I was to be real and vulnerable. And I ultimately I was able to instill in myself the convictions that I have and think through it clearly.
Yeah.
And my mom would be like, so obviously your debating was good for us. You know, that was my,
Yeah.
and it became my love language. If somebody talks with me and calls
I'm
me.
going to debate them.
No. Yeah, joking. Yeah. No. But just like conversation, you know, communication is a love language. And that was something that they saw in me. And that's what they, you know, they were very key. Like, okay, she needs quality time and conversation. And that's how she receives love. You know, physical wasn't a big thing for me, like obviously. But it was communication, conversation, and quality time.
Yeah.
Just being with them, sitting next to them, being with them. It could just be coloring with me. It could have looked like several things, but that was my love language, and they saw that and they instilled that in me. And that was a key thing, is like figure out their love language. It's very hard. Don't force your love language on them, but look at their love language. How are they receiving love? Does that look like gifts? Okay, that's not manipulation. That's how they're receiving that love.
Yeah, or time.
Or time, or communication, or quality time, or acts of service. Do they like it when you do things for them or with them, you know?
Yeah.
So just, you know, be keyed into how the foster child responds to your love.
That's
What,
really
what would you say to that family that's contemplating foster care and wanting to go down that road of becoming foster care parents? Recently, even this week, I talked with a family that's thinking about doing foster care, and they've just, to be honest, have said, I don't know if I could do that, because I don't know how I could bring a child into my home, love a child so well, almost look at them as my own, and then they leave. I don't want to put myself through that. What would you say to that? Because I know, to be honest, that's a lot of.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
That's a common thought.
It's a common thought, and it's a loaded question.
For me, it starts with, you have to submit that regardless of how you feel, reunification is important.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
God, if it was God's plan and reunification was his plan, it would have been best for me to be back with my birth parents if that was the intent.
Yeah.
And I think we have to submit that, is that fostering isn't always to adopt. Fostering could just be loving them in that moment through that trauma.
In that season.
And giving them that safe space. You might not have them forever, but you can make a difference in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
in that time.
You can make a difference in that moment. You can speak into their life.
Yeah.
And
And they
are.
won't forget love. You can't forget when you're surrounded by rejection, and not feeling like you're enough, and you get that little bit of love, you don't forget that, you know, and, it, you know, like I don't want to feel like all of my foster parents that I was with were like terrible people. No, there were a lot of them that loved me and cared for me and wanted the best for me. And, you know, I still see them every once in a while and be like, oh my gosh, is that Peggy? And, you know, like it doesn't bother me anymore, but just like, you are like so different than you were as a child. You're so much happier. You're doing such great things. And for me, it's not necessarily a building up from me, but it's an understanding that like, I am not the same person that I was back then. I am not that brokenness. I am a child of God, and I am a daughter of a king. And that was something that I took on as my identity, and it was very clear.
Wow.
So I would say, if you are thinking about foster care and it seems like something that you could not give them back, just remember that it's not about you, it's about the child. I think very often it comes to a point where we forget that. And you have to remember that if it's best for them to go back to their birth parents, then that's love, because that's who God meant for them to be with. Their parents might have a rough season right now, but they're gonna get healing. They're gonna get help, and then they're gonna be okay, and they can go back and they can have that relationship again. Or if that is, and rights are terminated, then that's a whole nother trauma that you have to process, because they're getting removed from somewhere that they're meant to be. That's where God intended them to be. You know, that's the natural nature, is to be with your birth parents. And when that is broken, you have a whole nother trauma that you have to heal from. So whatever that looks like, there is already some brokenness, but you have to submit to God's plan in their life. It's hard, but it is love. Submitting that will is love, because that adds less stress into that child's life. If it's an issue of it is not your child, which I respect, you know, there's a lot of people that said, I couldn't have somebody else's child in my life. That's fine. So I guess that means then you should do something else.
Yeah, there's always
that doesn't mean that you don't have to not foster care. Maybe international adoption looks like that, because you can, you know, go through that process and adopt, and foster care isn't for you. Yeah. Or you can support and learn more about that. Get invested with people who have foster kids and be like, hey, like, I want to know more and see if I could do this. That looks like babysitting them and instilling in them and seeing that, you know, be respite. Figure that out. If you don't feel like jumping in all the way, then put your toe in, educate yourself, figure it out, see what's going on, and then work from there.
We've been saying on this podcast, you know, since we started filming, just do something.
Yeah. It could be anything.
I mean, God's command is very clear in the Bible, you know, to care for children who need families. Just do something, whether that's pray, getting involved in some way, just step out and dive.
And when I share my story, it does physically make people uncomfortable, and I can see that in a personal, and that it should be, because sin, like I said, sin should make you uncomfortable. No child should have to face that ever.
Yeah.
But because they do, we need to act. If we don't, then you're ultimately, you know, you're not, if you feel that pull and that's what you feel like, you know, God is there, you should be there too. I mean, it just makes sense.
That's good.
It's kind of, you know, it's just common sense. And I think so many people overthink it and don't think that they're qualified. If you can love a child and you can give them a safe home, that's all the requirement there is. If you educate yourself, if you instill in yourself a community and you get the support and you want to love that child, that's all you need.
And there's amazing organizations like Beauty Amidst the Ashes that's going to come alongside of you and create a community to be there with you.
But start with education. I cannot, there are so many resources out there right now that you can find. Educate yourself and then do something about it. So,
and that can be overwhelming.
Again,
with how much education there is out there. And I think that's awesome that you guys do that Hope Conference.
I mean, I speak and I educate about triggers and trauma and what that looks like in the moment of the foster care, you know, having a child come into your home. What does that look like? Examples of triggers and trauma. But each part of the triad, there is trauma. And we all face it. And I think understanding the effects of trauma, but then also knowing if there's healing from trauma. And so I think if you're going to take the step to educate yourself, come to Hope Conference. Doesn't mean you're committing to foster care and adoption, but it does mean that you're taking the first step to love the fatherless. James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion. If you're going to do it, educate yourself and then do something about it. I mean, it's pretty clear.
And Peggy, you mentioned too that, you know, oftentimes when you share your story, it makes people uncomfortable. And adoption is created out of brokenness. It's messy. It comes with a cost. It's raw, but there is beauty behind it. So that's something too that we got to think about. Oftentimes, just to be vulnerable and honest, you search adoption on YouTube, you get that glorious adoption story that just has all this good, but in reality, there's so much brokenness behind every adoption. Every adoption has brokenness behind it.
Yeah.
Whether it's that birth mom, giving up that child and with that sacrificial love and what she's faced.
And what my birth parents faced.
Yeah.
They faced their own trauma. And
to
that's what I
the
speak
child
to.
in foster care, to the couple facing infertility, to the orphan, in an orphanage overseas, whatever it may be, there's brokenness behind every adoption story. And it's raw and real. And, I'm just thinking as you're sharing, like God, the Father loved us so much that he sent Jesus, and he paid that ultimate cost so that we could be adopted into his family. Yeah. Why wouldn't I want to step out and dive and make a difference in the lives of children that need families?
He's not absent in the middle of brokenness. We so often think that Christ is not, when we're going through that, God is not absent in the middle of that. He was obviously right there with me going through all of that.
Absolutely.
And I think that when I understood that, and when I really evaluated that now as an adult, I understood that what I had to go through, if I didn't have that trauma, I wouldn't have the story that I have, and I wouldn't connect with it's very hard for children who have gone through the former foster youth or adoptees to share their trauma, because that is something that they've gone through and that is something that they've protected. But because I only share certain parts of my childhood. I don't share some of the other traumas that I have faced, because it's just not what that's just not, maybe eventually, but not yet. And I am okay with that. And I give that encouragement to them. Share what you can, because what you share does make a difference.
Absolutely.
How you use your story does make a difference. And how do I edify other people? I do share parts of my trauma that do make people uncomfortable, but I do it because God gets the glory in the end. So what happened to me is not my identity. And really, I speak to this. Yes, I do use my life to advocate for adoption and foster care, but I'm not just a foster youth. I'm not just an adoptee, and I'm not just, Peggy Porter who is adopted. I'm a child of a king. I am, made for eternity. And he is my father. Yeah. Regardless of if my adoptive parents had messed up, or regardless of what happens to them, I am a daughter of a king, and I am God's child. And I think that when I really accepted that and clearly understood that, I could heal in the ways that I needed to, because I was no longer alone, and I could see that. And that's how I use my identity now, is that, yes, I do use my story for adoption, but ultimately the gospel is prominent in my life and who I am. And I have to speak to that. It's not about me. There's nothing in my life. If I did not have God, salvation, and Jesus Christ and his unconditional love, I would not be here today. I would not be the person that I am today. It completely transformed my life. It took me as a 5-year-old understanding that I had a purpose and he had a plan for me. Yeah. And my story wasn't over.
That's amazing.
And that's who my identity is in.
So tell us this. If you could go back and talk to 5-year-old Peggy, what would you say? And I think this is powerful too, because if we have foster parents watching right now, who have that child living with them in their home, that can hear somebody who lived in foster care, that went through foster care to adoption, and can hear you speak from that place of speaking to 5-year-old Peggy.
I was worth dying for. He sent his son to die for me. And that was my worth. There was nowhere in my time of foster care that I felt worth until I was at Mark and Bonnie Porter's house. And it wasn't until I was introduced to Jesus Christ that I really fully understood my worth. So I would tell her that she is worth. She deserves love. She deserves hope and joy and safety. And I found that in my salvation through Jesus Christ. And because of that, that's really it, is that you are worth it and you are worthy. And that's something that was instilled in me learning the gospel and reading the scriptures, is that I am worthy. He died for me, knowing me on that cross, knew all of the sins that I would commit and did commit and the things that I would go through. And he loved me, and he loves me unconditionally, and that I am worthy and I'm worth that.
Wow.
What would you say, Peggy, to people watching this? And, maybe adoption or foster care is not part of your story, and it's not even something that you've even thought about.
Yeah.
But maybe right now you're going through something in your own life that could be a trial or a hardship, and you're just at that place of, where's God in the midst of this?
That's good.
We have our organization is called Beauty Amidst the Ashes, and where is God in the midst of ashes? When we're in the ashes, where is God in the midst of that? What would you say to that viewer that's watching that's just in that place right now?
I mean, that's really loaded. I don't
It
know.
is
Like, can you break it down?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
just
a
like
question.
break it down to maybe something a little bit more simpler for me to kind of focus on a specific spot.
Talk about hope. What does hope look like?
Okay. Hoping in Christ. I know, I just feel like I'm like, not Jesus juking. I'm just being genuine. When you have a child in your home and when you're looking at that, their hope can't be in you. Their hope can't be in their birth parents. Their hope can't be in anything but Christ. Because he's the one that holds their future.
That's good too.
So pointing them to Christ in
That's
that.
Yeah.
Because if they don't know Christ, they might not know hope.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And hope comes from Christ. There's nothing, hope can't be absent from Christ. Christ is where we get our hope.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a daily instilling in them, is that, and for them, they have to seek, and foster care and adoptive parents have to seek that hope, because they're going to see a lot of brokenness in the system continually.
That's
You're going
really
to see a
good.
lot of brokenness. And if you can't you're not going to find hope in the system. You have to find hope from Christ
Yeah.
and the gospel.
good. Wow. Okay, so I have a question from earlier.
Okay.
I was wondering, when you were talking about your birth parents, what are your feelings towards them? You talked a lot about what your feelings were in those moments, but what are your feelings towards them now?
Now, it has changed. And I would say that, though, something that my adoptive parents instilled in me was that they never, ever spoke negatively about them, regardless of what they thought. They never, ever thought negatively about them. Never spoke. They just spoke truth and the things that I experienced and happened, and acknowledged that and gave that its space, but told me that if I ever wanted to contact them, I could. But they wanted to make sure that I did it legally, and that they wanted me to wait till I was 18.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
And so that was just a boundary. That was something that they instilled in me. It wasn't a punishment. It was just simply like, hey, I want to wait until you're ready to face that. 18 came around and I said, I don't really want contact. And that was just for me to understand that right now I can't seek that relationship.
Yeah.
I have no malice towards my birth parents. They were carrying and had so much going on in their lives. But for right now, I care about them enough to wish the best for them.
That's
I
awesome.
want the best for them. I want them to know that Jesus died on the cross for them too. And that the gospel is real in their lives.
Yeah.
But I
Relevant to
also have
anybody.
to step back and realize that that's not my place right now. Maybe eventually.
Yeah.
But for me, that relationship would be toxic and would be bad for me. And once I realized that had nothing to do with outside sources, that was nothing to do with my birth parents. Some people are like, oh, well, that's like your biological parents instilling in you this mindset. No, it was my own. That was me realizing that in that moment, it is healthy for me to care about them and to love them from a distance and want every best for them and all of my half siblings that are out there. But that relationship isn't for me right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable with us today.
Yeah, for
Really
sure. And I
appreciate
want
that.
to end it too with like one of my favorite verses that really helped me through this process too, and really just instilled in me the hope. I would say again that hope was from Scripture and from God, because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't know what that, in words in the Bible is where I would seek that.
Yeah.
And so it comes from 2 Corinthians 12. For if I want to boast, I wouldn't be a fool, because I would be telling the truth. But I will spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me or hears from me, especially because of the extraordinary revelations. Therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. Concerning this, I pledged with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more in my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. If I hadn't gone through what I did, the trauma that I did, it's not my identity. It's not who I am now. But I cannot boast in anything but Christ and his strength in my weaknesses.
So good.
Wow.
And even going back to that question too of maybe the viewer watching is in that place right now where they're going through their own trials or hardships. Sometimes God wants us to look back and remember that he is faithful. You know, like you shared, his power is made perfect in that weakness.
You don't want that weakness in that moment. I didn't want to go through what I did, and I didn't want that. And like you said, he begged the Lord to take it from him, but then he realized that thorn in the flesh was for a purpose, and that his weakness was for a purpose, and that God's power would be so much more relevant. And that's all that I can testify to. God's power throughout my whole life and my future. I have had opportunities beyond full circle moments. Even just sitting here at this podcast right now, 5-year-old me could not have imagined. Yeah. And to share my story and to be vulnerable and passionate about, I am bold because of that, because I see that Christ had a purpose, and I can use my voice to testify to his unconditional love and to his power, not my own. Nothing about me, only him.
Wow. Well, Peggy, thank you so much for being transparent and vulnerable.
Thank you.
We love hearing your story. We love seeing the beauty that's in the story, and also just the fact that you're willing to share just the realness of what it was like.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, the good, the bad, the ugly of growing up in foster. And that needs to be heard. People need to hear that. And I know that we often have conversations about that. Like we need to share that raw. People need to know that raw. So thank you again for sharing that.
Thank you for giving me a safe space.
Yeah,
it's important.
You're a valuable part of our team. I'm gonna start crying already. And we're so thankful to have you involved in Beauty Amidst the Ashes and on our staff. You bring so much to the table, and it's just awesome to see that God has taken that past and is now using that as your stepping stone into something that he's calling you to advocate on behalf of children in foster care, and to be a voice for that is just so powerful. So thank you, Katie, for joining us today. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast and watching us. Please share it. Hit that subscribe button. Spread the word. We want to get this out. Ultimately, we want to share the gospel. Ultimately, we want to just make known this beauty of adoption and what that looks like. So thank you.